Carl Jung said that everything that is not made conscious appears in our life as fate. Welcome to The Shadow of Marriage. There is a paradox at the heart of love that most people spend their entire lives inside without ever fully seeing it. It is not a complicated paradox once it is named, but it is one of those truths that is so counterintuitive, so contrary to everything we have been taught about what love requires, that it tends to arrive not as insight, but as resistance. The paradox is this: the more you need to be loved, the less lovable you become, and the more genuinely, practicedly, quietly at home you are in yourself, the more you have built the kind of internal life that does not require external confirmation in order to feel real, the more naturally, effortlessly, and sustainably love comes toward you. This is not a motivational slogan. It is a clinical observation. It is something I have watched play out with a consistency that has long since ceased to surprise me, across years of work with couples and individuals who are trying to understand why their relationships feel the way they feel, why the love they are offering is not producing the connection they are hungry for, why the harder they try, the more the person they are trying with seems to retreat, why the relationships that feel most important to them are also somehow the most exhausting, consuming more than they restore, demanding more than they return, leaving them at the end of each day with the specific depletion of someone who has been working very hard in the wrong direction. The answer, in almost every case, begins in the same place, not in the relationship, in the self, in the specific quality of relationship that a person has with their own inner life. The stability, the groundedness, the practiced self-knowledge that constitutes what I'm going to call, for the purposes of this video, genuine self-love. Not the self-love of affirmations and self-care routines and the performance of confidence. The self-love that is built through the slow, unglamorous daily work of actually knowing yourself, your needs, your values, your wounds, your strengths, and of treating that knowledge with the consistency and the care that any genuine relationship requires. If you are watching this and you have been wondering why the love in your marriage does not feel the way you thought it would feel, why you are giving so much and receiving what feels like so little, why the person you chose seems to be responding to something in you that you cannot quite see, I want you to stay with me. Subscribe to this channel now and turn on notifications, because what we are going to explore today is not relationship advice in the conventional sense. It is a clinically grounded examination of the psychological mechanism that determines, more than any other single factor, the quality of love that a person is able both to give and to receive, and understanding it changes everything. Let me tell you about a woman I will call Claire. Claire was 36 years old when she first came to see me. She had been married for 8 years to a man named David, kind, attentive in his way, professionally successful, not unkind. The marriage was not in crisis in any obvious sense. There had been no betrayal, no dramatic rupture, no single event that had broken something irreparably. What had happened was slower and more difficult to name than any of those things. What had happened was a gradual, almost imperceptible withdrawal on David's part. A quality of presence that had been warm and engaged in the early years and had, over time, become something more careful, more managed, more like the presence of a person who was performing the role of husband with competence and diminishing enthusiasm, rather than the presence of a man who was genuinely glad to be there. Claire had spent 3 years trying to understand what she had done wrong. That was the frame she brought to our first session. not what had happened in the marriage, but what she had done to cause what had happened. She had reviewed the early years of the relationship with the particular thoroughness of a person conducting an internal investigation, looking for the error. The moment she had changed, the thing she had begun doing or stopped doing that had produced the withdrawal she was living with. She was convinced there was something specific to find, something she could identify and correct, if she could only see it clearly enough. I spent our first sessions listening to her investigation, and what I noticed, as she described it, was not what she was looking for. What I noticed was the investigation itself, the quality of attention she was bringing to the question of what she had done wrong, the thoroughness of her own self-examination, the way she held herself, her choices, her behavior, her emotional responses, as the primary variable responsible for the state of her marriage, and beneath all of that, with the specific consistency that I have learned to recognize as the most important signal in this kind of clinical work, the absence of any equivalent attention to the question of who she was and what she needed independent of David's response to her. Claire knew herself almost entirely in relation. She knew herself as David's wife, as the person who needed to be doing better at maintaining his engagement, as the woman whose efforts to connect were not producing the results they used to produce. She had a sophisticated vocabulary for her own failures and a remarkably impoverished one for her own worth. She could tell me, in precise detail, what she was doing that was not working. She could not tell me with any real specificity what she valued, what she needed, what gave her genuine pleasure independent of whether it pleased the people around her. The question of who she was when she was not in relation to someone else, when she was simply, plainly herself, produced in her a quality of blankness that was not ignorance. It was the blankness of someone who had spent so long orienting her entire identity outward that the inward landscape had become genuinely unfamiliar territory. Carl Jung wrote that, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And what was operating unconsciously in Claire's marriage, directing her behavior, shaping her responses, producing the specific dynamic she was living in and could not understand, was precisely this. She had built her entire sense of worth on the foundation of being loved well, not on the foundation of knowing herself well, not on the foundation of a genuine, practiced, internally generated sense of her own value, on the foundation of receiving, consistently and reliably, the confirmation from David that she was worth loving. And when that confirmation had begun, gradually and without announcement, to arrive less reliably, when David's withdrawal had created gaps in the flow of external validation she had organized her psychological life around, the entire structure had become unstable. She had not lost the relationship, she had lost the mirror, and without the mirror, she had lost, temporarily but devastatingly, herself. This is the clinical reality of what happens when a person's self-love is conditional, when it depends on being loved in a particular way by a particular person in order to feel real. It is not a character flaw. It is not a sign of weakness or emotional immaturity in any simple sense. It is almost always the entirely predictable consequence of an early environment in which love was experienced as something that needed to be earned, maintained, and continuously resecured rather than something that was simply, reliably, unconditionally present. Children who grow up in environments where love feels contingent on performance, where approval is given and withdrawn in response to behavior, where affection is a reward rather than a constant. Learn, in the deepest and most pre-verbal way possible, that love is not a stable state but a dynamic one, something that must be continually worked for, something that can be lost. And so they develop, as the most intelligent possible adaptation to that environment, an extraordinary sensitivity to the signs of whether they are being loved well or not, and an equally extraordinary orientation of their entire psychological life toward the maintenance of the conditions they believe will keep the love secure. This adaptation works, after a fashion, in childhood. It is the child doing the best she can with the environment she has been given. But it carries forward into adulthood in ways that tend to produce, with a consistency that I have observed across hundreds of clinical encounters, the exact opposite of the security it was designed to create, because the adult who has built her sense of worth on the foundation of being loved, well, brings to her intimate relationships an invisible but powerful need, the need for continuous external confirmation that tends to have a specific and entirely counterproductive effect on the people she is closest to. It tends to produce in those people a quality of pressure, a sense of being monitored, a feeling that their love is always being evaluated for sufficiency, always being tested against a standard that is never quite met, always being asked to do more work than love can reasonably be expected to do. And here is where the paradox I described at the beginning of this video operates with its most devastating precision. The person who needs the most confirmation produces, through the very intensity of that need, the withdrawal she most fears. The love that is organized around hunger tends to exhaust the person on the other side of it, not because that person does not love her, but because love that is organized around filling an infinite need is not experienced as connection by the person giving it. It is experienced as obligation, as labor, as the specific exhaustion of someone who is constantly being asked to be enough and consistently failing to be. This was what had happened in Claire and David's marriage, not through any malice on either side, not through any failure of love in the straightforward sense. David loved Claire. He had loved her from the beginning with the genuine, specific, person-directed love that is the only kind worth having. But across 8 years of marriage, something in the quality of how that love was being received had changed the quality of how it was being offered. David had gradually, without fully understanding why, begun to feel that his love was never landing, that no matter what he did or said or offered, there was always something more that was needed, always another reassurance required, always the slight, almost imperceptible quality of insufficiency that clung to every exchange, as though his presence were being measured against a standard he could never quite identify and never quite meet. He had not withdrawn because he loved her less. He had withdrawn because he was exhausted. And the exhaustion was not his failure. It was the predictable consequence of being, for 8 years, the primary structural support of another person's sense of worth, of being, functionally, the mirror that someone needed in order to know they existed. That is not a role that any person can sustain indefinitely. Not because they lack love, because they lack infinite capacity. Because love, however genuine and however deep, cannot do the work that a relationship with the self is supposed to do. Maybe this is already landing somewhere real for you. Maybe you are watching this and recognizing, in the description of Claire's investigation, in the thoroughness of her self-examination, in the quality of her outward orientation, in the specific blankness that appeared when she tried to describe who she was, independent of David's response to her, something that is at least partially familiar, something that names, with uncomfortable precision, a dynamic you have been living in without having had quite this language for it? If so, I want you to stay with that recognition rather than immediately moving to assess whether it applies to you or not. Because the recognition itself, the willingness to sit with the question of whether your sense of worth is built on internal ground or on external confirmation, is the beginning of everything. It is the beginning of the work that changes not just how you are in your marriage, but who you are in your own company. And who you are in your own company is ultimately the foundation of everything else. There is a layer beneath this that almost no one identifies, even in the most honest self-examination. And it is the layer that, when it finally becomes visible, changes the entire landscape of what is possible. Because the question I most commonly encounter in clinical work with people who are living Claire's pattern is this: but how do I love myself more? Not as a rhetorical question, as a genuine, bewildered, practically urgent inquiry. They understand intellectually that the external orientation is the problem. They understand that the hunger for confirmation is driving the dynamic they are trying to escape. They understand, in the cognitive sense, that building a more secure internal foundation would change everything, but they do not know how to do it. Because the how of self-love, the actual, practical, daily work of building a genuine relationship with yourself, is something that almost no one teaches. It is obscured behind the language of the concept, which tends to be either vague and inspirational or reductive and prescriptive, and almost never precise in the way that actually helps. The precision that actually helps begins with understanding what self-love is not. It is not self-esteem in the narrow sense, the positive evaluation of your own qualities and achievements. It is not confidence, the belief in your ability to perform competently in the world. It is not self-care in the popular sense, the practices and routines that maintain physical and emotional well-being. All of those things can contribute to it, but none of them constitute it. What self-love actually is, at its most fundamental level, is a relationship. A relationship with yourself that has the same essential qualities as any genuine, sustaining, intimate relationship. Consistency, curiosity, care, the willingness to know the difficult parts as well as the easy ones, the commitment to show up for yourself even when, especially when, it is inconvenient or uncomfortable to do so. And like any genuine relationship, it is built not through insight alone, but through practice, through the accumulated, daily, sometimes boring, sometimes difficult practice of actually treating yourself the way you would treat someone you genuinely loved. Not performing self-love, not thinking about self-love, practicing it in the specific, actionable, moment-by-moment sense of that word. The first dimension of this practice is what I call self-knowledge, genuine, specific, updated self-knowledge that goes beyond the general outlines of your personality and history into the living, present reality of what you actually feel, need, value, and want right now, not in the abstract, in the specific context of your actual life as it is currently configured. This sounds straightforward. In practice, for people who have spent years orienting primarily outward, it requires a deliberate and sustained effort of inward attention, a regular, committed practice of asking yourself the questions that you have been directing toward other people. What do you need? What would help? What feels right? And then actually waiting for the answer to come from inside rather than looking for it in someone else's face. If you recognized yourself in Claire's story, If the description of the conditional self-worth, the external orientation, the hunger for confirmation that exhausts the people who love you, I want you to know that the ebook that accompanies this channel was built for exactly this work. It contains a structured self-knowledge practice that goes far beyond the general instruction to know yourself and into the specific sequential daily process of actually doing it. The link is in the description. I will come back to it. But stay with me, because what comes next is the part that most people never reach. The part that explains not just why self-love changes you, but why and precisely how it changes what love is able to do between two people. The second dimension of the practice of genuine self-love is what I call self-consistency, the experience of being someone who keeps their word to themselves. This is, in my clinical observation, the most underestimated and the most practically powerful component of building a genuine internal foundation. Not the grand commitments, the resolutions to change everything at once, the dramatic declarations of a new beginning, but the small ones, the daily ones, the ones that no one else will ever know about or hold you accountable for. The commitment to rest when you are tired rather than pushing through to prove something to yourself. The commitment to say no to the things that deplete you, even when saying yes would make someone else more comfortable. The commitment to honor what you know about yourself, what you need, what matters to you, what you will not accept, with the same reliability that you bring to the commitments you make to other people. Why does self-consistency build self-love? Because self-trust, the felt, visceral, in-the-body experience of being someone you can rely on, is the foundation of the internal security that genuine self-love requires. A person who does not keep their promises to themselves has a specific and entirely predictable relationship with their own interior life. They do not trust it, not because the inner life is untrustworthy, but because the experience of repeatedly overriding it, of saying I need rest and then pushing through, of saying I will not accept this and then accepting it, of identifying a limit and then watching yourself cross it, creates a quality of internal unreliability that extends to everything, including the sense of one's own worth, including the capacity to receive love without immediately doubting it, because a self that has learned it cannot be relied upon to keep its own word, is a self that does not have the stable ground from which to say, with genuine conviction, I am worth loving. I know this not because someone is telling me so, but because I have the evidence of my own consistent daily self-honoring behavior. Claire's self-consistency practice began with something so small she almost dismissed it as not worth doing. She committed in our 4th session to one thing, not a list of changes, one thing. She committed to taking 20 minutes each morning before anyone else in the house was awake to sit with her own thoughts without directing them toward the question of the marriage or David's emotional state or the state of their connection. 20 minutes of being with herself, not productively, not therapeutically, not with an agenda beyond the simple act of showing up for her own interior life without immediately converting it into intelligence about the relationship. 20 minutes of treating her own inner life as worth her time and attention for its own sake, independent of what it produced. She told me 3 weeks later that this practice had been simultaneously the most simple and the most difficult thing she had done in years. Simple because it required nothing beyond showing up. Difficult because showing up, simply being present in her own company without immediately orienting that presence toward the management of something external, had revealed with uncomfortable clarity how thoroughly unfamiliar her own inner life had become to her, how long it had been since she had spent time in it without purpose, without the goal of understanding something about the marriage, or processing something that had happened with David, or figuring out how to approach a conversation she needed to have. Her own interior, in the absence of all that purposeful occupation, had felt initially like an empty room. And the emptiness was not the absence of content, it was the absence of the habit of noticing the content, the absence of the practiced attention that turns an interior life from a space you pass through into a space you inhabit. This is what the research on what psychologists call interiority suggests, that the experience of having a rich, accessible, genuinely inhabitable inner life is not simply a function of temperament or intelligence or emotional sensitivity. It is a function of practice, of the accumulated daily habit of turning attention inward and treating what is found there as worth attending to. And for people who have organized their psychological lives primarily around outward orientation, around the monitoring of external conditions and the management of other people's emotional states, that practice has often been neglected for so long that the inward turn feels, at first, like arriving somewhere foreign. Like standing in a room you used to live in and not recognizing the furniture. But the furniture is still there. The self that has been neglected in favor of the outward orientation is still there. It has not been destroyed by the neglect. It has simply been waiting, with the patient persistence of anything that is fundamentally real, for the attention that would allow it to become visible again. For Claire, what began to become visible over the weeks of her morning practice was not dramatic. It was not a sudden revelation about who she was or what she needed. It was something quieter than that and more durable. It was the gradual accumulation of small recognitions, noticing that she felt more herself on the mornings when she had kept the commitment than on the mornings when she had not. Noticing that the specific quality of anxiety she usually carried into her days, the low-grade, ambient monitoring of the relationship, the constant background assessment of where things stood with David, was slightly less consuming on the days when she had spent 20 minutes simply being with herself first. Noticing that the act of keeping the commitment repeated across days and then weeks was producing something that she recognized tentatively and with appropriate suspicion of her own hopefulness as a very small but genuine increase in the felt sense of her own presence, of being, in the specific and unglamorous sense of the word, more there. This is what self-consistency produces, accumulated over time, not confidence in the performed sense, not the sudden eradication of insecurity or need or the hunger for connection, but groundedness, the specific, practical, in-the-body experience of having a self that is present, consistent, and reliable enough to be stood on, a floor rather than a shifting surface. And it is from this floor, from this gradually constructed, daily maintained ground of genuine self-knowledge and self-consistency, that everything about how love operates between two people begins to change. I want to explain the mechanism of this change precisely, because understanding it is what makes the practice feel worth sustaining through the periods when it is not producing visible results. The mechanism is this: when a person has built a genuine internal foundation, when their sense of their own worth is no longer primarily dependent on external confirmation, the quality of how they are present in their intimate relationship changes in a way that is palpable to the person on the other side of it. not because they become more strategic or more withholding or more challenging in some calculated sense, but because the specific quality of need that was previously the dominant emotional weather of their presence in the relationship, the hunger, the monitoring, the low-grade anxiety of a person whose sense of worth is contingent on their partner's response, begins to recede. And what takes its place is something that is almost inevitably more attractive, more genuinely interesting to be near, more capable of producing, in the person they are with, the specific experience of being with someone rather than being needed by someone. This distinction between being with someone and being needed by someone is the heart of what changes when self-love changes. Being needed is exhausting in the specific way that I described in the first half of this video. It requires the person being needed to be continuously enough, to fill a gap that is never quite filled, to be the primary structural support of another person's psychological well-being, and human beings, however loving, cannot sustain that role indefinitely without it costing them something, without the relationship beginning to feel, at some level below conscious articulation, like obligation rather than choice. Being with someone is different. Being with someone is the experience of genuine contact between two people who are both present, both there, both contributing their actual selves to the exchange, both capable of receiving as well as giving, both grounded enough in their own worth that what they bring to the relationship is not primarily need, but genuine desire. The desire to know this particular person, to be known by them, to build, together, something that neither of them could build alone, not because they are incomplete without it, but because it is genuinely, specifically, irreplaceably good. That quality of contact, that genuine meeting of two present, grounded, self-possessed people, is what David had fallen in love with at the beginning. Not a person who needed him in the consuming, structural way that Claire had gradually come to need him. A person who wanted him, who found him genuinely interesting, who brought to the relationship a quality of aliveness and self-possession that made being with her feel like an expansion rather than an obligation. And what his gradual withdrawal had been responding to over the 8 years of their marriage was the gradual replacement of that aliveness with something else, something that was still love. Claire's love for him was never in question, but that had become organized around the question of whether he was going to continue to be there in the specific, confirming way she needed him to be. The shift that Claire's practice began to produce, slowly, non-linearly, with regressions and difficult weeks and periods where nothing seemed to be changing, was the very gradual return of the aliveness that had been displaced, not the performance of aliveness, not the strategic management of her neediness in ways that would make her appear more attractive to David, but the genuine, practiced, internally generated experience of being present in herself, of having a self that was worth being in, that she was choosing to show up for, that she was learning to find genuinely interesting, independent of what it produced in the relationship. And David noticed, not immediately, not in the form of a sudden re-engagement or a dramatic shift in the quality of his presence, but in the specific, cumulative way that a change in the emotional weather of a relationship always eventually registers. First as something slightly different in the texture of ordinary exchanges, then as something recognizable enough to be felt if not yet named, then as something that began to pull him with the gentle but unmistakable quality of genuine desire back toward the person he was married to. There was an evening, about 4 months into Claire's practice, when something happened that she described to me as unremarkable, and that I recognized as the clinical climax of everything we had been working toward. She was in the kitchen after dinner doing nothing in particular. The children were in bed, David was in the living room, the house was quiet in the specific way that houses are quiet when the day's activity has subsided, and what remains is simply the presence of two people in the same space. And David came into the kitchen, not with purpose, not to get something or say something necessary, but simply, he came in and stood near her and said, "You seem different lately." Not a compliment exactly, not a declaration, just an observation. But Claire told me that the quality of attention in it, the simple fact of him noticing, of him being curious enough about her to say it out loud, landed in her with a weight that she had not felt in years, and her response, which she described with a mixture of pride and incredulity as unlike anything she would previously have said in that moment, was, "I think I am. I've been spending time with myself, getting reacquainted," and David looked at her for a moment in the specific way that people look at someone when they are genuinely seeing them rather than simply observing them. And he said, "I like it. This is what self-love does to a marriage when it is practiced genuinely rather than performed strategically. It does not fix the marriage from the outside. It does not resolve the conflicts or heal the wounds or change the difficult history. It changes the person. It changes the quality of their presence. It changes what they bring to the relationship, from a hunger that exhausts to a groundedness that invites. And that change in what is brought is felt by the person on the other side as something they want to move toward rather than something they need to manage the distance from. I want to be honest about what this means in the practical, ongoing context of a marriage. Because the evening in the kitchen was not the end of the work for Claire and David. It was a beginning. The groundedness that Claire had been building through her practice was real and it was growing, but it was not yet solid enough to withstand the full weight of the relational history they carried between them. There were still conversations that pulled her back into the old pattern, the monitoring, the hunger for confirmation, the anxiety about whether she was enough. There were still nights when she lay awake doing the investigation she had described in our first session, looking for what she had done wrong. But those nights were less frequent, and when they came, she had something she had not had before, the practice of returning to herself, the habit of noticing when the orientation had shifted back to the outward, and of choosing, deliberately and without drama, to come home. The second practice that I give to people who are doing this work, the practice that builds on self-knowledge and self-consistency and moves the work into the relational context, is what I call the grounded ask. This is the practice of communicating your needs in your marriage from a position of self-possession rather than from a position of need. The difference between these two positions is not about what is asked for, it is about how the asking is done. A need communicated from the position of hunger sounds like a demand or a complaint or an implicit accusation. It carries within it the weight of all the previous times the need was not met. It arrives already defensive, already slightly desperate, already oriented toward the fear of not being heard rather than the genuine possibility of being understood. A need communicated from the position of self-possession sounds different. It sounds like someone who knows what they need, believes it is reasonable to need it. is willing to ask for it clearly and without apology, and is not organizing their entire sense of worth around whether the request is granted. It sounds, to the person receiving it, like an invitation rather than a demand, like something it is possible to respond to with genuine care rather than something it is necessary to defend against or manage. This distinction transformed the quality of how Claire and David communicated over the months that followed. Not immediately, not without the awkwardness of two people learning a new language for something they had been failing to communicate in the old one, but genuinely. And the genuine change in communication produced, with the reliability that it always produces in clinical work when it is arrived at through real internal change rather than technique alone, a genuine change in the quality of their connection. Not a perfect connection, not the resolution of every difficulty or the healing of every wound, but something real, something that was being built from different ground than what had come before, from the ground of two people who were both, in their imperfect and ongoing ways, learning to show up more fully for themselves, which made it possible for them to show up more fully for each other. This is the truth at the center of what this video has been exploring. You can know how much you love yourself by looking at the partner you have chosen, and by looking at what the dynamic of your relationship reveals about the quality of internal ground from which you are loving, not as a judgment, as information, as the honest, clinically grounded recognition that the love you are able to receive is limited by the internal space you have built to receive it. That the love you are able to give is shaped by whether it comes from fullness or from hunger, and that the work of building the internal space, the genuine daily practiced work of knowing yourself, keeping your word to yourself, and treating your own inner life as worth showing up for, is not separate from the work of loving well. It is the foundation of it. The ebook that accompanies this channel contains the full framework for the 3 practices I described today: self-knowledge, self-consistency, and the grounded ask, with detailed sequential guidance for each one. It contains a structured process for identifying the specific ways in which your sense of worth has been built on external confirmation rather than internal ground, and for beginning the gradual, sustained work of rebuilding it from the inside. And it contains specific language frameworks for the grounded ask practice, for communicating your needs in your marriage in a way that invites response rather than triggering defensiveness. The link is in the description. This is the next step for the person who is ready to do the work that changes not just their relationship but the self they bring to it. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because this series continues and every video goes somewhere the last one did not. What we are building here together is a body of understanding that takes seriously both the complexity of intimate relationship and the foundational importance of the relationship you have with yourself. Jung said that the privilege of a lifetime is becoming who you truly are, not the self that was constructed in response to what others needed you to be, not the self that learned to orient entirely outward in order to keep the love secure, the self that is genuinely, practicedly, quietly at home in its own company, the self from which every other form of real love becomes possible. Those who love themselves more are loved more. Not because self-love makes you more attractive in the surface sense, but because it makes you more present, more genuinely available for contact, more capable of receiving love when it is offered without immediately converting it into evidence for a case you are perpetually making about your own worth, more capable of giving love that comes from genuine desire rather than from the hunger that exhausts. More capable of being, in the deepest and most sustaining sense of the word, with another person, because you have learned to be, first and most importantly, with yourself. Your story does not have to continue the way it has been going. The hunger does not have to remain the dominant weather of your interior life or your marriage. The work of building genuine internal ground is real work, and it takes real time, but it produces something that no amount of effort directed outward has ever been able to produce: a self that is worth coming home to, a love that does not need to be earned because it already exists, generated from the inside, available as the ground from which everything else grows. Welcome to the shadow of marriage, and welcome to the most important relationship you will ever build.